So, flexion. If you've got a back pain, should you completely avoid it like the plague? Answer is, it depends. So everyone that's got back issues has got different sensitivities and slightly different pain triggers and different levels of sensitivity to those pain triggers. So if someone's highly flexion tolerant, and again we can test that, so if you're familiar with McGill's work, you understand that we can run through provocation tests to answer that question pretty clearly and pretty quickly. If someone's highly sensitive to flexion intolerance, and they may or may not have things like disc bulges and sciatica and all sorts of other things going on with it, but if someone tests very positive to that, and that causes them pain in their back, my goal is trying to help them find ways to avoid that as much as they can, because they might not always get rid of it 100%, but if they bring it back into a sort of tolerable level, and they can manage it, you might find that's one of the biggest things that's going to help take away their pain. And if you change those habits for the long term, then that's going to mean that they're less likely to have back issues later on in life as well. So again, long-term success is always the key with this sort of stuff. But it depends on each person. So what does it depend on? Well, one thing it can depend on, which doesn't get talked about enough when we talk about this flexion debate, is actually genetically the shape of your discs. Because again, not everyone's the same. So, we have people that tend to have a slighter, more flexible, I'd call it like bendy, twisty spine, tend to have more symmetrical or ovoid shaped discs. So they'll tolerate a lot more flexion before that collagen in annulus fibrosus starts to break down and delaminate and create a problem. So straight off the bat, just through genetics, they've got a far greater tolerance to doing flexion and bending and twisting and doing stuff and more work on the spine. So for them, it's less of an issue. But if someone tests positive for it, I'm going to need to help them to sort of bring that back into a tolerable level. It's just that their tolerable level is going to be higher than someone who has more of a asymmetrical or limacon shaped disc. So it's called limacon because it looks kind of a bit like a lima bean. So these sort of people here, they have less ability for a bendy, flexible spine, but have a far greater propensity for bearing great load and compression for the spine. So, if you find a good powerlifter or a strong man, I bet the bottom dollar is that they've probably got discs more likely to be shaped like this than someone who has got discs shaped like this. The trade-off is that if you've got a disc shaped like this, you trade off some of that bendy, flexible mobilityness in the spine to be able to have that ability to bear great load. Someone who's got a more symmetrical disc, or they've got a more bendy, twisty, mobile spine and greater tolerance to things like flexion, they've now got less tolerance for things like heavy compression. So if I was going to put 200 kilos on someone's back for a squat, I'm going to have far greater success at this person when they do it than this person. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying that, in the kind of the structure of their spine, if you want to lift heavy weights, you're better off going with that design. So again, your first choice, if you want to have a particular goal, was to pick the right parents who had the right genetic traits to give you the things that you need to do so you can thrive in your chosen sport and activities. So again, someone with a spine like this, less bendy, less twistable, but can take a lot more compression on their spine and bear great load. So that's one of the things you need to take into account when we talk about flexion. The other thing we need to talk about really is your goals as well. Like, is part of your goal, do you need to be able to do a lot of flexion in your sport? Like, is there a need for it to do it? So one example, it might be you're working with a gymnast, or maybe even like an Olympic diver that needs to get into a pike position. So, if they're only going to be active until maybe their mid-20s competing, they might be willing to trade off that little bit of danger of doing a bit too much excessive flexion and causing some problems. So they've got a chance to maybe compete, do well, win a medal, whatever it may be. And then they might be more than happy then to, once they've sort of retired from their sport, then they'll start to look after their back and just take the consequences of dealing with what they've got after that. That might be a case. But for the average person, there's not generally a lot of reason why you want to do everything with flexion, because ideally what you want to do is, use your hips as much as possible, and then maybe get the rest of it, or a lot of it, from flexion in your actual thoracic spine, your upper back. So for most people, you generally don't need to keep doing lots of stuff, flexion from the spine. Not to say that you don't ever flex from your spine, because there's certain things it's kind of impossible to avoid flexion completely. For example, things like putting on your shoes, for example. But the idea is that we assess the person, work out what their tolerance is to flexion, and then we give them appropriate tools to manage it within their tolerance. And again, some people have got far greater tolerance, some people have very little tolerance. Me, for example, I have very little tolerance, so I have to be careful how I spend that bank account day to day. I need to save it with good movement and posture habits so that when I go to things and do things like jiu-jitsu, or I might necessarily have much say in the amount of position that I get into, I know I've got plenty of bank account left to not get myself in trouble. So flexion, it's not the most easiest thing in the world. You don't need to completely avoid it 100%. In fact, it's actually impossible to avoid it completely 100% unless you've had your back, braced with bits of metal. However, what you need to do is just be realistic with what your tolerance is to it and what your need is to be in a flex position. If you don't really need to get into a flex position, there's other ways that we can move, then my suggestion would be to work on those other ways to move, to spare it where you can, to minimize the chances of you getting a flare-up if you're flexion intolerant. If you have a very specific need where you need to get into flex positions, the same idea applies, the same principle. You manage it where you can, so you've got plenty left in that bank account to spend it when you need to. So again, flexion isn't the end of the world, it's excessive flexion. That's the problem if you are flexion tolerant, because eventually it can lead to breaking down the collagen in your disc and lead to things like disc bulges and herniations. So again, not the end of the world, not we need to completely avoid it, we just need to have the appropriate level for each person so it's well within their tolerance limits. And as with any back injury, before we even begin to plan and do things, we need to answer the first question is always, well, it depends. Everybody's different. Everybody's got slightly different genetics, everyone's got slightly different injury histories, and everyone's got slightly different goals. So we need to understand clearly where the person is, where they need to get to, and then we know we can answer this question, it depends, and we can pick the appropriate plan for that person.